A millionaire dines alone in an exclusive restaurant until two impeccably dressed little girls step up to his table. Their eyes burn into him before one speaks. "We're Mia and Grace, and we're your daughters." His world shatters. Daughters? Impossible. Then his ex-lover steps forward, dropping a letter onto the table. A past he never knew, a truth that will destroy everything. But if he never ignored them, who did? And why were they hidden from him for 8 years? Stay until the end, because what happens next will change everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The soft glow of crystal chandeliers cast elegant shadows across La Maison d'Or's burgundy walls, creating an atmosphere of refined exclusivity. James Calloway sat at his corner table, the best in the house, savoring the quiet sophistication that came with dining alone. The maitre d' had long ago learned not to seat other patrons too close, maintaining an invisible barrier of space around his regular guest. Privacy, after all, was the true luxury of wealth. He cut into his perfectly cooked filet mignon with practiced precision, the meat tender and pink inside, just as he preferred it. The familiar routine brought him comfort. Work until 7, dinner at 7:45, home by 9. No complications, no surprises, no mess. Just the way he liked it. This predictability was his armor against life's chaos. James lifted his Pinot Noir, admiring how the light caught the deep red liquid, creating tiny prisms in the crystal glass. Success had afforded him this life of careful control, this fortress of routine. His real estate empire stretched across Manhattan like a spider's web, each property a carefully calculated investment, each decision made with cold precision. He'd learned early that emotions were expensive. They cost time, energy, and focus. Better to keep things clean, simple, profitable. Emotions belonged to those who couldn't afford better. The wine touched his lips just as two small figures appeared at his table, materializing like ghosts in his peripheral vision. James lowered his glass slowly, his eyes narrowing at this unexpected intrusion. Two little girls stood before him, identical down to their carefully pressed navy blue dresses with crisp white collars. Their dark hair fell in neat waves past their shoulders, and their faces, something about their faces made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar ache. They didn't fidget or look around like normal children would, didn't show the usual childish uncertainty. Instead, they stared at him with an intensity that made him want to look away, their eyes carrying a weight far beyond their years. But James Calloway hadn't built his empire by showing weakness, so he met their gaze, steeling himself against their scrutiny. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice carrying its usual authority, though something in him already sensed the ground shifting beneath his feet. One of the girls, he couldn't tell which, stepped slightly forward, her movement precise and deliberate. Her chin lifted, and when she spoke, her voice carried a composure that sent a chill down his spine, echoing with certainty. "Hello, Mr. Calloway. We're Mia and Grace, and we're your daughters." The words hit him like a physical blow, shattering his carefully maintained composure. The restaurant seemed to tilt on its axis, the comfortable bubble of his controlled world cracking like thin ice. The ambient noise faded until all he could hear was the thundering of his own heart, each beat an accusation. James's fingers tightened around the wineglass stem until his knuckles turned white. His mind raced through possibilities, a prank, a mistake, a scam. But those faces, he knew those features. He'd seen them before, 8 years ago, in a woman he'd tried so hard to forget. His throat went dry, constricting around unspoken words. The perfectly cooked steak turned to ash in his mouth, his appetite vanishing like smoke. There must be some mistake, he managed, but even as he said it, he knew the truth of it. The shape of their eyes, the curve of their cheeks. He saw himself there, mixed with memories he'd buried deep. The click of heels on hardwood made him look up, the sound sharp as gunfire in his ears. A woman stepped forward from the shadows, and James's blood ran cold, freezing in his veins. Elena Harper stood there, but not the Elena he remembered. Gone was the soft-spoken art gallery assistant who'd captured his attention all those years ago. This Elena carried herself like steel, her blue eyes sharp as broken glass, years of hardship etched into the set of her jaw. The wine glass trembled in his grip, betraying his composure. James Calloway, who prided himself on never losing control of any situation, felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble like a house of cards. The twins continued their unblinking stare, their presence a silent accusation that pierced through every defense he'd built, every wall he'd erected. He set his glass down with deliberate slowness, fighting to keep his hand steady, though the tremor in his fingers betrayed him. The truth stood before him in triplicate, and for the first time in decades, James Calloway found himself completely, utterly speechless, his empire of control dissolving in the face of this unexpected reckoning. The crystal wine glass trembled in James's grip as he stared at the two girls before him. Their faces were like mirrors of each other, delicate features, determined blue eyes that seemed to pierce right through his carefully constructed walls. His throat felt dry, too tight to swallow, and his pulse thundered in his ears with a deafening intensity that threatened to drown out all other sounds. "This is impossible," he managed to say, but his voice came out hoarse and uncertain, barely more than a whisper. That's when Elena stepped forward from the shadows and James felt his world tilt on its axis. She looked different from the woman he remembered. Gone was the soft, hopeful light in her eyes, replaced by something harder, something that spoke of years of struggle and determination. Her tailored black dress and perfectly styled hair projected an image of control, but James could sense the fury simmering beneath her composed exterior. The slight twitch at the corner of her mouth betrayed emotions he knew she was fighting to contain. The ambient chatter in the restaurant had died down to hushed whispers, like a theater audience holding its breath before a dramatic scene. From the corner of his eye, James could see other diners trying to pretend they weren't watching while hanging on every word. A waiter hovered uncertainly nearby, his hand nervously adjusting his bow tie as he clearly struggled with whether to intervene in what was becoming an increasingly tense situation. "Impossible." Elena's voice was quiet but sharp enough to cut glass. "That's interesting coming from you." Each word dripped with years of bottled-up resentment. James set his wine glass down with deliberate care, trying to gather his thoughts. His fingers lingered on the stem, seeking something solid to ground him in this surreal moment. But before he could speak, Elena reached into her purse and withdrew a pristine white envelope. She dropped it onto the table next to his half-eaten filet mignon. It landed with a soft thud that somehow seemed to echo in the tense silence. A simple piece of paper that carried the weight of unspoken accusations. "You abandoned us, James." The words fell like ice between them, each syllable precise and cutting. "But before you deny it, I need you to read this." The twins hadn't moved, standing shoulder to shoulder like tiny sentinels, their matching blue dresses making them appear even more like mirror images. The one on the left, was it Mia or Grace, lifted her chin slightly, her expression unnervingly mature for an 8-year-old. The other kept her eyes fixed on the envelope, a slight tremor in her small hands the only sign of emotion. Her lower lip caught between her teeth in a gesture that struck him with painful familiarity. James felt sweat gathering at his collar despite the restaurant's perfect climate control. His chest constricted as though someone had wrapped iron bands around it, squeezing tighter with each breath. Every instinct honed from years of ruthless business dealings screamed at him to stand up and walk away. This had to be some kind of mistake or manipulation. He'd built his empire by never letting emotion cloud his judgment, by walking away from any situation that threatened his control, by maintaining the icy demeanor that had become his trademark. But his body wouldn't move. His eyes kept darting between Elena's face and the girls. Their faces. And with each look, something deep inside him recognized features he saw in the mirror every morning. The set of their jaws, the arch of their eyebrows, the way they held themselves with such precise dignity. It was like seeing fragments of himself reflected back in miniature, impossible to deny or dismiss. The envelope sat on the table like a bomb waiting to detonate, its corners crisp and precise against the white tablecloth. Around them, the restaurant's elegant atmosphere had become suffocating. The soft classical music felt discordant now, the golden lighting harsh and exposing, casting shadows that seemed to dance mockingly across their faces. A wine glass clinked somewhere in the distance, followed by a quickly hushed conversation, the sound jarring in the thick tension. Elena reached out and took each girl's hand in hers, her grip gentle but protective. Without another word, she turned away, the twins moving in perfect synchronization with her, their small feet silent against the plush carpet. James felt something he hadn't experienced in years, pure, unfiltered panic rising in his throat, threatening to choke him. His hand shot out of its own accord, fingers closing around the envelope's crisp edge, the paper crinkling slightly under his trembling grip. James stared at the pristine white envelope on his table, his fingers hovering over its edge. The restaurant's warm lighting caught the slight yellowing of the paper, a testament to its age. His heart hammered against his ribs as he picked it up, feeling its weight in his hands. The cream-colored paper felt delicate, almost fragile, like the memories it contained. With trembling fingers, he tore open the seal. The sound seemed too loud in his ears, despite the quiet murmur of conversation around him. A couple at the next table clinked their wine glasses, but James barely registered it. Inside, he found a single sheet of paper folded neatly in thirds. The handwriting was unmistakably Elena's, elegant yet determined strokes that brought him back to a time he thought he'd forgotten. Each curve and loop of her penmanship stirred something deep within him. The date at the top made his breath catch. March 15th, 2015. 8 years ago. 8 years of lost moments, missed firsts, and memories he could never reclaim. "Dear James," he read silently, his eyes moving across the words. "This is my final attempt to reach you. I've sent countless letters, left numerous messages with your office. Each time, I'm told you're unavailable or uninterested in speaking with me." His throat tightened as he absorbed each word. His brow furrowed. No, that couldn't be right. He'd never received any messages, any letters. The familiar knot of anxiety began to form in his stomach. "I need you to know that I'm carrying your children, twins. The doctors say they're healthy, and I can already feel them moving. I know this isn't what either of us planned, but they deserve to know their father. They deserve to have you in their lives." The words blurred slightly as his vision swam. James's hands began to shake more violently. He looked up briefly at the twins standing before him, their faces so familiar now that he really looked. They had his mother's eyes, the same warm brown that gazed back at him from childhood photographs, the same slight tilt at the corners. "If you truly want nothing to do with us, I understand, but please, James, have the decency to tell me yourself. Don't hide behind your assistants and secretaries. Don't let your father's people shield you from this responsibility." The accusation in her words stung even after all these years. His father's people. The words hit him like a physical blow. Memories started flooding back. His father's insistence on handling all his personal correspondence during that period, claiming it would help James focus on the massive Morrison deal that would make or break his career. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. "These girls are your daughters, James. Whether you choose to acknowledge that or not, it's the truth. They will grow up knowing where they came from, and someday they might come looking for answers. I hope when that day comes, you'll have better ones than silence." Each word felt like another weight added to his shoulders. The letter was signed simply, Elena. Her signature carried the same strength and grace she'd always possessed. James set the paper down carefully, as if it might crumble under his touch. His mind raced through the implications. His father had intercepted Elena's letters. Every call, every attempt at contact, blocked and buried, all while he'd been consumed with building his empire. The realization made him feel sick to his stomach. He lifted his gaze to Elena, who stood watching him with an unreadable expression. The twins remained beside her, their small faces studying his every reaction. Their eyes held questions he wasn't sure he could answer. "I never got these," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt inadequate, hollow in the face of 8 years of absence. But they were true, perhaps the truest words he'd spoken in this restaurant in years. His fingers brushed against the letter again, as if touching it might somehow bridge the gap between then and now. James's fingers pressed into the letter, creating small creases in the aged paper. The restaurant's ambient noise had faded to a distant hum, leaving only the sound of his thundering heartbeat in his ears. Sweat beaded at his temples as the weight of revelation pressed down on him. "I never got these letters, Elena," he said, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't felt in years. "Not a single one. I swear it." Elena's laugh was sharp and bitter, cutting through the air between them. Her hands shook slightly as she gripped her water glass. 8 years of silence, James. 8 years of watching our daughters grow up without their father. 8 years of questions I couldn't answer. And now you expect us to believe you just didn't know? The twins stood like sentinels beside their mother, their matching navy blue dresses making them look like mirror images of disapproval. Mia's small hands clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles white with tension, while Grace's eyes remained fixed on the floor, her lower lip trembling almost imperceptibly. "You expect us to believe that?" Mia's voice was barely above a whisper, but the ice in her tone made James flinch. Her eyes, so much like his own, held a wisdom far beyond her 8 years. The hurt radiating from her small frame was almost tangible. James pushed his barely touched plate aside, leaning forward with desperate intensity. The silverware clinked against fine china, drawing concerned glances from nearby diners. "I would have come," he insisted, his carefully maintained composure cracking like thin ice. "If I had known, if anyone had told me..." "Save it." Elena cut him off, her words sharp as glass. She placed protective hands on the girl's shoulders, pulling them closer to her sides. "You can keep your millions, James. We don't need anything from you. We never did. We've managed just fine on our own." The words hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. James had built his empire on reading people, on knowing exactly what they wanted. But here, faced with these 3 figures from a past he didn't even know existed, his usual confidence crumbled like a sandcastle in the tide. His throat felt tight as he watched Elena gather her purse, the designer leather suddenly seeming like hollow compensation. The twins fell into step beside her, their movements synchronized, practiced. A family unit complete without him. They were turning away from him, just as suddenly as they had appeared in his life. James's heart pounded against his ribs so hard it hurt. The familiar walls of La Maison d'Or, usually a sanctuary of controlled solitude, now felt like they were closing in, suffocating him. His carefully ordered world was slipping through his fingers like sand, and for the first time in his meticulously managed life, he felt raw, genuine panic rising in his chest like a tide. Elena's heels clicked against the polished floor as she led the girls away, each step echoing like a gavel falling. Neither twin looked back at him. They followed their mother without hesitation, their small shoulders straight, heads held high, a posture that spoke of pride and pain in equal measure. James watched them go, his chest constricting with each step they took toward the exit. His wine glass sat forgotten, the expensive Pinot Noir now tasting like ashes in his mouth. The letter trembled in his hands, proof of a life he should have known about, should have been part of. 8 years of memories he could never recover, birthdays he hadn't celebrated, first days of school he'd missed. For the first time in his carefully controlled life, James Calloway felt completely, utterly powerless in the face of what he'd lost. The autumn wind whipped around the corner of La Maison d'Or as Elena led the twins toward the waiting valet. James stood frozen for a moment, his expensive leather shoes suddenly feeling like they were filled with concrete. The sight of them walking away sent an unfamiliar panic coursing through his veins, making his throat constrict with each passing second. The valet pulled up with Elena's silver Honda Civic, its modest appearance a stark contrast to the row of gleaming luxury vehicles lining the curb. The twins' matching navy dresses swished as they walked, their small hands firmly clasped in their mother's grip. Their dark hair caught the golden light spilling from the restaurant's windows, reminding James of how much they looked like him. "Wait," James called out, his voice carrying across the sidewalk. Several other diners paused to watch the scene unfold, their forks suspended mid-bite, their conversations dying to whispers. He didn't care. For the first time in his carefully controlled life, appearances didn't matter. Nothing mattered, except the three figures walking away from him. His long strides carried him across the pavement, designer shoes clicking against concrete. "Elena, please." The word "please" felt foreign on his tongue. When was the last time he'd begged for anything? His perfectly crafted world of boardrooms and business deals had never required such humility. Elena's shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn around. The valet stood awkwardly by the car door, keys dangling from his fingers, trying to look anywhere but at the unfolding drama. "If I never got the letters," James said, his voice low and urgent, "I deserve to know why." His heart hammered against his ribs, the evening's perfect solitude now shattered beyond repair. 8 years of absence hung between them like a heavy curtain. The twins exchanged a look that seemed far too knowing for their age. Mia's eyes narrowed slightly, her jaw set in a way that mirrored his own stubborn determination, while Grace's expression softened just a fraction, hope warring with caution in her gentle features. They both turned to their mother, waiting, the silence stretched thin as a wire between them. Even the traffic noise seemed to dim, as if the city itself held its breath. The valet cleared his throat softly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, keys jingling quietly in his nervous grip. Elena's grip on the girl's hands loosened slightly. Her back straightened, and she finally turned to face James. The streetlight caught the steel in her eyes, making them flash like blue ice. She studied him for a long moment, her expression calculating, weighing years of history against this sudden confrontation. "Fine," she said finally, each word precise and careful. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., the Saint, Regis Lounge." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "If you really want to know." The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. Without waiting for his response, she opened the car door. The twins climbed into the back seat, their movements synchronized in a way that made James's chest tighten with longing. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of Grace looking back at him, her expression unreadable in the growing darkness. Elena slid behind the wheel, her movements deliberate and controlled, like a chess player making a crucial move. James stood rooted to the spot as the car pulled away from the curb. The red taillights grew smaller and smaller until they merged with the sea of traffic heading downtown. His heart continued its frantic rhythm, and his hands trembled slightly at his sides, betraying the emotion he fought to contain. For the first time in years, James Calloway, the man who orchestrated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, was completely and utterly out of control. The certainty that had defined his life had crumbled in a single evening, replaced by a desperate need to understand what he had lost and what he might still have a chance to gain. The St. Regis Lounge breathed old money and quiet power. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across dark wood panels and plush leather seats, their glow reflecting off brass fixtures and antique mirrors. James sat at his chosen table, deliberately positioned to see both entrances. His Italian suit was perfectly pressed, his tie a precise Windsor knot, his cufflinks gleaming with subtle authority. Everything about him screamed control, except for his hands, which kept tightening around his espresso cup until his knuckles turned white. 10 minutes early, as always. The familiar routine should have been comforting, but today it felt hollow, almost mocking. He watched the steam rise from his cup, his mind racing through possibilities he'd rather not consider, each scenario worse than the last. The waitstaff moved silently around him, topping off coffee cups and clearing plates with practiced efficiency. Their crisp black uniforms and discreet movements were exactly why he preferred this establishment. Today, though, their quiet efficiency only heightened his tension, making him acutely aware of each passing minute. At exactly 10 a.m., Elena appeared with the twins. They moved as a unit, their footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor like a quiet drumbeat. The girls still wore matching outfits, simple cream sweaters and navy-pleated skirts this time. Their faces were carefully blank, but their eyes missed nothing, darting around the room before settling on him with unsettling intensity. Elena chose the seat directly across from him, the twins flanking her like small sentinels, their shoulders straight and chins lifted. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unasked questions and years of absence. James cleared his throat. "Let's get to the truth." His voice came out rougher than he intended, betraying the emotion he fought to contain. Elena's face remained impassive as she reached into her leather bag. She pulled out a thick manila folder and slid it across the table's polished surface. The folder scraped against the wood with a soft hiss that seemed to echo in the tense atmosphere. James opened it, his fingers suddenly clumsy against the smooth paper. Inside, page after page of evidence lay organized with clinical precision. Phone records showing dozens of calls to his office, each one highlighted in stark yellow. Copies of letters marked "Return to Sender" in angry red ink. Bank statements showing transferred money that had been sent back untouched, the numbers a damning testimony to his attempted contact. Each page felt like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. His chest tightened as he flipped through them, the reality of 8 lost years hitting him with crushing force. The weight of missed birthdays, holidays, and everyday moments pressed down on him like a physical thing. The twins watched him intently, their young faces showing a maturity that no 8-year-old should possess. Their eyes held shadows of disappointment and wariness, far beyond their years. Grace leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the tension like a blade. "If you never ignored us, then who did?" James lifted his eyes to meet Elena's steady gaze, his throat constricting. His stomach twisted violently as the pieces clicked into place, forming a picture he'd been blind to for far too long. He knew exactly who had the power to intercept his communications, who had access to his accounts, who would have wanted to keep this hidden from him. His own parents' faces flashed through his mind, their perfectly maintained facade hiding something far more sinister. The knowledge made him physically ill, bile rising in his throat. His carefully constructed world was crumbling, and the truth behind it was uglier than he'd imagined. The legacy his parents had been so desperate to protect had cost him the only thing that truly mattered: his daughters. James's fingers tightened around the folder, his knuckles turning white. The expensive leather chairs of the St. Regis Lounge suddenly felt uncomfortable, suffocating. His pulse thundered in his ears as he struggled to form the words, the weight of revelation crushing against his chest like a physical force. "Elena," he said, his voice rough with emotion, barely above a whisper. "Who stopped you from reaching me?" Elena's face remained calm, but her eyes held a storm, years of frustrated attempts and blocked communications swirling in their depths. "Your parents." The words hit James like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He stared at her, his mind refusing to process what she'd just said. The coffee in front of him grew cold, forgotten, its aromatic steam no longer rising from the delicate china cup. That's impossible," he whispered. But even as he said it, pieces started falling into place like a terrible puzzle. His parents' sudden insistence that he focus on work 8 years ago, their careful monitoring of his calls and mail, the way they'd steered him toward more suitable relationships, always finding subtle faults with anyone he dated. "They paid me to disappear, James." Elena's voice cut through his thoughts like a blade through silk. "But I never took their money, and when I refused, they buried every trace of me, made sure I became a ghost." Mia and Grace sat perfectly still, their matching navy blue dresses making them look like tiny mirrors reflecting each other. Their eyes never left James's face, studying every twitch, every reaction, cataloging each micro-expression for future reference. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. James shook his head, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, destroying hours of careful grooming in one desperate gesture. "My own parents." His voice cracked, splintering like thin ice. "They knew about you? About the girls?" "They knew everything." Elena's words were sharp, precise, each one carefully chosen and delivered with surgical accuracy. "Every letter I sent, every time I tried to call, every attempt I made to tell you about your daughters." She gestured to the folder, her hand steady while his trembled. "It's all there. The proof of their interference. Every single attempt documented." James flipped through the papers with trembling hands, each page revealing another layer of betrayal. Phone records showed dozens of calls to his office and home, all mysteriously missed or redirected. Certified letters marked, "Return to sender." Even bank statements showing attempted transfers of money that had been sent back, each one a cry for help that never reached its destination. "Your father's secretary intercepted everything at the office," Elena continued, her voice steady but cold as winter frost. "And your mother made sure nothing reached you at home. They were very thorough, James. Very efficient." The word efficient, one his parents had always praised him for being, now felt like poison on his tongue. His chest tightened as he looked at the twins, really looked at them. 8 years. They'd stolen 8 years from him. 8 birthdays, 8 Christmases, 8 years of first words and steps and tears and laughter. Mia's eyes narrowed slightly, watching his reaction with the sharp attention of a hawk tracking its prey. Grace's expression softened just a fraction, seeing the genuine shock and pain on his face, her natural empathy warring with years of learned caution. James's jaw clenched so hard it hurt, the muscle ticking visibly beneath his skin. The past he thought he knew had been carefully constructed by his parents, a perfect lie designed to keep him focused on the family business, on their legacy. They'd robbed him of his own legacy, his daughters, all to maintain their perfect, controlled world. He leaned back in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white, the polished wood creaking under his grip. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse with anger and grief, a father's pain finally finding its voice. "I need proof." Elena's eyes were unreadable as she met his gaze, years of determination hardening her resolve. "Then get it." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hotel's entrance as James followed the trio outside. His legs felt heavy, each step weighted with the morning's revelations. Ahead of him, Mia and Grace moved in perfect synchronization, their matching navy blue dresses swaying as they walked. They bent their heads together, whispered words passing between them like secrets. "Mia, Grace." His voice carried across the space between them, softer than his usual commanding tone. They stopped in unison, turning to face him. Their expressions were mirror images of careful consideration, neither hostile nor welcoming. Elena stood behind them, her hand resting protectively on each girl's shoulder. James stepped closer, his expensive shoes clicking against the pavement. The usual confidence in his stride was gone, replaced by something more hesitant. "I need time." Mia tilted her head, her eyes sharp and analytical. "Why?" The question hung in the air between them. James swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion he wasn't used to showing. "Because if this is true, then my own parents betrayed me, and I need to find out just how deep it goes." The twins exchanged glances, having one of those silent conversations that only identical siblings can manage. The afternoon traffic hummed around them, but in their little bubble of space, time seemed to stand still. Finally, Mia spoke, her voice carrying a weight far beyond her years. "If you really care, prove it." The challenge in her words was clear. James felt it settle on his shoulders like a physical weight. He nodded, accepting the gauntlet she'd thrown down. He stood rooted to the spot as they walked away, watching until they disappeared into their waiting car. His jaw clenched tight enough to hurt, the muscle working beneath his skin. The familiar rage of being crossed in business was nothing compared to this new personal fury building in his chest. With precise movements, he pulled out his phone. His voice, when he spoke, was cold and sharp as winter ice. "Get me everything on my family's financial records. Now." James sat in his dimly lit study, the morning sun barely filtering through the heavy curtains. The crystal whiskey glass on his desk caught the light, amber liquid untouched. His fingers drummed against the polished mahogany, each tap echoing his racing thoughts, the steady rhythm a poor distraction from the storm brewing inside him. 8 years. 8 years of his life had been stolen, not by strangers, but by his own flesh and blood. The betrayal tasted bitter in his mouth, worse than any business deal gone wrong. The knock at the door was sharp, professional. "Come in," James called, his voice rougher than usual, scratchy with emotions he refused to name. Marcus Hale stepped into the room, his presence filling the space with quiet competence. The private investigator had worked with James for years, handling delicate matters that required absolute discretion. But this was different. This was personal in a way that made James's usual iron control waver. "You look like hell," Marcus said, clutching a thick manila folder. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept much either. James didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the folder, knowing it held answers he both craved and dreaded. The truth waited inside those pages, ready to shatter what remained of his world. Marcus placed the file on the desk with a soft thud. "It's all here. Everything you asked for." He paused, running a hand through his graying hair. "And James? It's not good." His voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much. With steady hands that betrayed none of his inner turmoil, James opened the folder. The first page was a bank statement, his account from 8 years ago. Red circles marked suspicious transfers, money moved without his authorization. Each mark felt like an accusation. "They used your power of attorney," Marcus explained, his voice low. "Your parents had access to everything. They played this like a chess game, thinking 10 moves ahead." James flipped through more pages. His throat tightened as he found letters, dozens of them, all bearing his signature. But the strokes were wrong, the curves too sharp. "Forged," he muttered, bile rising in his throat. "Professional job, too. They hired someone who knew what they were doing, spent a fortune to make it look authentic." Phone records came next. Calls from Elena's number, systematically deleted before they could reach his phone. Text messages intercepted, emails blocked and erased. Each page revealed another layer of deception, another carefully constructed wall. "Your parents built a wall around you," Marcus said, leaning against the desk. "Made sure nothing got through. They even had people watching Elena, making sure she couldn't reach you directly. The surveillance was constant." James's jaw clenched as he studied a particularly damning document, a contract for a private security firm paid to keep Elena away from his office building. His fingers trembled slightly as he traced the signatures. "The money trail is clear," Marcus continued. "They spent millions orchestrating this, changed your personal assistant, controlled your schedule, even manipulated your social circle. Anyone who might have known Elena was quietly pushed out of your life. It was methodical, precise." The weight of it all pressed down on James's chest. Every memory of the past 8 years took on a new, twisted meaning. Those business trips his parents insisted he take, carefully timed to keep him away when Elena might be near. The sudden staff changes, all part of their plan. His entire life had been a carefully choreographed dance, and he'd never noticed the puppet strings. "What about the twins?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper, rough with suppressed emotion. Marcus pulled out another document. "Birth certificates. They tried to have them sealed, but I found copies. They're yours, James. DNA match would be conclusive, but looking at those girls..." He shook his head. "You don't need a test to see it. They have your eyes, your determination." James set the file down carefully, his hands curling into tight fists. The betrayal ran deep, cutting through years of trust and family bonds. His own parents had orchestrated this elaborate scheme, robbing him of his daughters, of their childhood, of countless moments he could never get back. First steps, first words, first days of school, all stolen. This wasn't just careful planning or misguided protection. This was calculated destruction, a deliberate erasure of an entire chapter of his life. Everything he thought he knew about family, about trust, about love, it all crumbled under the weight of these revelations. His knuckles turned white as his fists tightened. The whiskey glass sat forgotten, a silent witness to the unraveling of everything he thought he knew. Outside, the sun continued to rise, oblivious to the way his world was falling apart. James's footsteps echoed across the marble floors of his penthouse as he paced, each step a thundering reminder of his mounting anxiety. The thick manila folder on his glass coffee table seemed to mock him with its presence, taunting him with secrets long buried. Inside lay the truth about years of calculated deception, proof that his own parents had systematically erased Elena and his daughters from his life. A betrayal so complete it made his chest ache. His stomach churned violently. The whiskey decanter caught his eye, golden liquid gleaming in the afternoon light, but he walked past it with deliberate steps. He needed a clear head for this conversation, perhaps the most important one of his life. The intercom's buzz made him flinch, breaking through his troubled thoughts. Marcus's voice crackled through, steady and professional as always. "Sir, Ms. Harper and the girls are here." James took a deep breath, straightened his tie with trembling fingers. "Send them up." The elevator doors opened moments later with a soft ding. Elena stepped out first, her posture rigid with barely contained tension. She wore a simple black blazer and jeans, practical, understated, a stark contrast to the luxury surrounding her. Behind her came Mia and Grace, both in matching blue sweaters that made their eyes seem even more striking. Their faces were carefully blank, but their shoulders were tense with anticipation. "Thank you for coming," James said, his voice rougher than he intended, emotion bleeding through despite his best efforts. Elena's eyes swept across the penthouse, the floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the city skyline, the expensive art adorning pristine walls, the carefully curated furniture. Her lip curled slightly in distaste. "Let's get this over with." The twins settled onto his leather couch, sitting perfectly straight, hands folded in their laps like little soldiers preparing for battle. They looked so young, yet their eyes held something old and wary, the kind of wisdom that comes only from disappointment. James picked up the folder, his fingers tight around it, knuckles white with tension. "What you suspected. You were right." He extended the file toward Elena, willing his hand not to shake. "But I wasn't the one who did it." Elena stared at the folder like it might bite her, suspicion etched in every line of her face. After a long moment, she took it, her movements precise and controlled, as if handling evidence at a crime scene. She opened it, started reading, the paper crackling in the heavy silence. James watched her face, cataloging every micro-expression, saw the slight widening of her eyes, the tightening of her jaw, the color draining from her cheeks. The twins leaned in, trying to peek at the papers, their identical faces pinched with curiosity. "Bank transfers," James explained, his voice low and pained. "Letters intercepted, phone calls blocked. My parents, they orchestrated all of it, every last detail." Elena's hands trembled slightly as she turned another page, the paper rustling accusingly. "They forged your signature." "Yes." "They returned my letters." "Yes." Elena's voice caught, raw with remembered pain. "They offered me money to disappear." "Which you never took," James finished, respect and regret mingling in his tone. Mia and Grace exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across their young faces, cracking their carefully maintained masks. Elena closed the folder with a sharp snap that echoed through the room. Her blue eyes met his, cold as winter, but swimming with unshed tears. "Proof means nothing, James. The damage is already done." The words hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. But he saw something in the twins' expressions, a flash of something. Interest? Hope? They were watching him intently, their gazes burning into him, waiting to see what he would do next. Elena stood, clutching the folder like a shield. 8 years, James. 8 years. We can't get back. James swallowed hard past the lump in his throat. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to make her understand. But she was right. All the proof in the world couldn't erase the pain of those lost years, couldn't give back the bedtime stories never read or the birthdays never celebrated. Mia and Grace rose in perfect sync, their eyes never leaving his face. They said nothing, but their silence spoke volumes. They were waiting, watching to see if he was truly worth giving a chance, if he could somehow bridge the chasm 8 years of absence had created. James stared into his glass of bourbon, watching the amber liquid catch the city lights streaming through his windows. The proof was there, laid bare in black and white on his desk. But the weight of 8 lost years hung heavy in the room like an invisible fog. Elena stood by the window, arms crossed tightly against her chest, her reflection ghost-like against the darkening sky. The twins sat together on the leather couch, their shoulders touching, a united front against whatever was coming next. Their matching dark hair and serious expressions made them look even more alike in the dim light. "So what now?" Elena's voice broke the silence, quiet but sharp as a blade. James set his glass down without drinking, the ice cubes clinking softly. "Let me fix this." A bitter laugh escaped Elena's lips. "Fix it? How?" She turned to face him, eyes flashing with years of stored hurt. "Rewrite 8 years? Give back all the birthdays, the holidays, the first days of school? The skinned knees I kissed better while they wondered why their father never came?" James's jaw tightened until a muscle twitched. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his expensive suit jacket pulling across his shoulders. "I've spent the last 24 hours digging through everything. Every account, every document, every piece of correspondence." His voice grew rough with emotion. "They hid it all so well. Made me think I was too busy, too focused on work to notice missing calls or letters that never reached me." Mia and Grace exchanged glances, their identical faces unreadable in the half-light. But they were listening. Really listening, their bodies angled slightly toward him despite their defensive postures. "My own parents," James continued, disgust coloring his words. "They thought they were protecting the family legacy, keeping me focused on the business." He shook his head, running a hand through his graying hair. "They didn't want me distracted by family, by love." Something in Elena's expression shifted, just slightly. The steel in her eyes softened, almost imperceptibly, as if recognizing the genuine pain in his voice. "They had people watching you," James said, looking at Elena, "making sure you stayed away. They thought money would solve everything. They kept throwing it at the problem, thinking it would make you disappear." "But it didn't," Grace whispered, speaking for the first time. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying across the quiet room. "No," James agreed, meeting her eyes. "It didn't." Mia straightened, her eyes fixed on James with an intensity that reminded him of looking in a mirror. "So, what are you going to do about it?" The question hung in the air like smoke. James met her gaze steadily, seeing the challenge there, and beneath it, a desperate hope she was trying to hide behind her tough exterior. "Anything it takes," he said without hesitation, his voice firm with conviction. "Whatever you need, whatever it takes to make this right. I'll spend the rest of my life trying if I have to." The words settled in the room, heavy with promise. Elena uncrossed her arms slowly, watching James with cautious consideration. The twins sat straighter, their expressions shifting from guarded to thoughtful, the first crack appearing in their defensive wall. James meant it, every word. He would tear down his entire empire, brick by brick if that's what it took to fix what his parents had stolen from them all. The thought of his own flesh and blood orchestrating this betrayal made his stomach turn, but the sight of his daughters, so grown up, so strong, made him more determined than ever to make things right. The autumn breeze rustled through Central Park as James approached the wooden bench where Mia and Grace sat. His expensive leather shoes crunched on fallen leaves, and his tailored suit felt strangely out of place among the casual weekend crowd. The twins wore matching red sweaters and jeans, their dark hair pulled back in neat ponytails. They didn't look up as he approached, but he knew they were aware of his presence. Elena stood some distance away, pretending to read a book while keeping a watchful eye. James cleared his throat. "Hello, girls." They turned to him in perfect sync, their expressions carefully neutral. After a moment that felt like forever, they scooted apart slightly, making room for him on the bench. James sat down, his usual confidence deserting him. "What now?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Mia shrugged, her eyes fixed on a nearby maple tree. "We like ice cream." James blinked, caught off guard by the simple statement. Ice cream? Grace nodded, speaking up for the first time. Chocolate. A small smile tugged at James's lips. He stood up, gesturing toward the ice cream cart nearby. Well then, let's get some ice cream. The girls followed him to the cart, where an elderly vendor smiled warmly at them. James ordered 3 enormous sundaes, loaded with chocolate sauce, whipped cream, and sprinkles. The vendor handed them their treats and they returned to the bench. They ate in companionable silence. James watched as Mia carefully arranged her sprinkles before eating them one by one. Grace dove straight for the chocolate sauce, getting a small smudge on her nose that made her look her age for once. The tension that had been hovering over them since their first meeting began to lift, like morning fog burning away in the sun. James noticed how Grace's eyes crinkled when she smiled, just like his mother's used to. How Mia's determined focus reminded him of himself at that age. When they finished their ice cream, the girls stood up, wiping their hands on napkins. Without warning, they darted off toward the playground, their feet kicking up fallen leaves. James watched them run, their matching sweaters bright against the autumn colors. For a brief moment as they raced each other to the swings, James felt something unexpected bloom in his chest. Pride. These remarkable little girls were his daughters. The thought both terrified and thrilled him. Elena caught his eye from her spot under a nearby tree, her expression unreadable but somehow less hostile than before. James remained on the bench, watching his daughters play, wondering how many other simple moments like this he had missed. The Sunday morning sun had barely risen when James's phone buzzed on his nightstand. He reached for it, still groggy from a restless night. The screen lit up with a single message from Grace. Maybe. James sat up, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. His heart picked up speed as he read and reread that simple word. After years of calculated business decisions, this one word from his daughter left him completely uncertain. He showered and dressed quickly, choosing a casual sweater instead of his usual suit. Something told him today wasn't about maintaining his usual image. Within 20 minutes, he was in his Mercedes, following his instincts to Sweet Bean Cafe, the small, cozy place Elena had mentioned during one of their tense conversations. The bell chimed softly as he pushed open the door. The cafe smelled of fresh coffee and warm pastries. In a corner booth, Mia and Grace sat side by side, matching purple hoodies making them look even more identical than usual. 2 hot chocolates topped with whipped cream sat untouched in front of them. James approached slowly, noting how they watched his every move. Their faces were serious, too serious for 8-year-olds on a Sunday morning. He slid into the booth across from them, his hands folded on the table. "Good morning," he said softly. Grace reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of notebook paper. The edges were slightly crumpled, suggesting they'd worked on it for a while. She pushed it across the table, her small hand steady and determined. "Answer everything," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "No lies." Mia leaned forward slightly. "We'll know if you're lying." James picked up the paper carefully as if it might crumble in his hands. The questions were written in different colored markers, some in Grace's neat handwriting, others in Mia's bolder strokes. "Take your time," Grace added, finally reaching for her hot chocolate. James pulled a pen from his pocket, feeling strangely nervous. He'd signed billion-dollar contracts with less hesitation than he felt facing this simple sheet of paper. But these weren't business questions. They were questions about him, about who he was, about what kind of father he could be. Mia and Grace watched him intently, their identical brown eyes never leaving his face. They were looking for something, sincerity perhaps, or any sign of deception. James took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "Let's do this," he said, clicking his pen. His hand trembled slightly as he smoothed out the paper, ready to face whatever questions his daughters had prepared for him. The morning sunlight streamed through the cafe's windows, casting long shadows across their table. James sat straight-backed in his chair, his usual commanding presence softened by uncertainty. Across from him, Mia and Grace watched with matching intense gazes that seemed too old for their young faces. Mia leaned forward, her small hands flat on the table. Why did you leave our mother? The question hung in the air, sharp and heavy. James exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. I never left her. I thought she left me. His voice cracked slightly. One day she was just gone. No note, no explanation. Now I know why. Grace's eyes narrowed. But you never looked for her? I did, James said quietly. But every lead went nowhere. Every phone number was disconnected. Every address was wrong. He swallowed hard. Now I know why. My parents made sure of that. Did you ever think about her after you left? Mia's voice was steady, but her fingers twisted in her napkin. James looked down at his hands. Every day for years. He met their eyes. I loved your mother very much. Grace tilted her head. If your parents hadn't hidden us, would you have wanted us? The question hit James like a physical blow. Yes, he said immediately, his voice rough with emotion. More than anything. How can we believe that? Mia challenged. You're rich, important, busy. Where would we have fit in? Because money means nothing without family, James said. I learned that the hard way. That's easy to say now, Grace pointed out quietly. You're right, James admitted. I can't prove what I would have done, but I can show you what I'll do now. The twins exchanged a look, having one of their silent conversations. James waited, his heart pounding. What about your parents? Mia asked suddenly. They're still your family. James's jaw tightened. They stopped being family the moment they stole you from me. But they're your parents, Grace pressed. And you're my daughters, James said firmly. That matters more. The girls fell silent, studying him. James let them look, keeping his expression open, honest. He had nothing left to hide. Finally, Mia pushed her empty coffee cup away. We don't trust you yet. Her words were blunt, but not cruel. Then Grace spoke, her voice softer than her sister's. But we're not leaving. Not yet. James felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It wasn't forgiveness, he knew that. But it was something. A start. A chance. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The morning light caught the edges of their faces, and for a moment, he saw Elena in their features. The same determination. The same strength. James stood motionless by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, staring down at the glittering Manhattan skyline. The city sprawled beneath him like a sea of lights, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the morning's conversation with his daughters. Did you ever love our mother? Mia's question echoed in his thoughts, cutting deeper than he expected. He'd answered quickly, too quickly, with a yes, of course. But now, alone in the growing darkness of his apartment, doubt crept in. Did he? Had he ever truly loved Elena? Or had he simply gone through the motions of what he thought love should be? James turned away from the windows and walked to his study. In the back of his closet sat a box he hadn't opened in years. He pulled it out, dust coating his fingers. Inside were remnants of his college years. Old textbooks, papers, and beneath it all a small photo album. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. There she was, Elena at 19. The photograph captured her in mid-laugh, her head thrown back, dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Her eyes sparkled with joy and possibility. She was radiant, full of life and hope. James sank into his leather chair, the photograph heavy in his hands. He remembered that day clearly now. It was their third date, a picnic in Central Park. Elena had packed sandwiches and insisted on wearing a yellow sundress despite the slight chill in the air. She'd laughed when he'd tried to give her his jacket, saying she'd rather be cold and pretty than warm and boring. The memory stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. Elena had looked at him back then as if he hung the moon and stars, as if he could do no wrong. He'd basked in that adoration, hadn't he? Soaked it up like a plant turning toward the sun. But had he returned it? Had he ever looked at her that way? James set the photograph down on his desk, running a hand over his face. The truth was beginning to surface, uncomfortable and undeniable. He'd enjoyed being loved by Elena more than he'd actually loved her. He'd taken her devotion for granted, assumed it would always be there. When she disappeared, he'd been angry, hurt. But had he fought for her? Had he hired investigators, searched every hospital, called her friends? His pride had been wounded, so he'd retreated into his work, built his empire, and told himself he was better off alone. James closed his eyes, the weight of realization settling heavy on his shoulders. He never fought for her, not once. Not when his parents disapproved, not when she vanished, not even when she tried to reach him through all those letters. He'd failed her, and in failing her, he'd lost everything that mattered. 8 years with his daughters, the chance to be a father, the opportunity to become someone better than the cold, calculating man his parents had shaped him to be. The truth sat bitter on his tongue. He never fought for Elena because he never truly loved her enough to fight, and that realization hurt more than any business loss ever had. James's hand hovered over the crystal decanter, ready for his nightly ritual of drowning out his thoughts. The city lights twinkled beyond his windows, a familiar comfort he'd grown used to over years of solitude. His phone buzzed against the glass coffee table, breaking the silence. He picked it up, his breath catching when he saw Mia's name. His daughter. It still felt strange to think those words. The message was brief, but hit him like a punch to the gut. Come to Mom's apartment. 9 p.m. If you're serious. James set the phone down and ran his fingers through his silver-streaked hair. Elena's apartment. The thought made his stomach twist. He hadn't been anywhere near her world in 8 years. It was a test, he knew that much. Mia was challenging him, seeing if he'd step out of his comfort zone, his carefully controlled environment. His thumb hovered over the keyboard. The right business move would be to suggest neutral ground, a restaurant, maybe the Saint. Regis again. Somewhere he could maintain control of the situation. But this wasn't business. This was his daughter reaching out, offering a thread of possibility. On my way, he typed, hitting send before he could second-guess himself. James walked to his bedroom closet, passing the rows of perfectly pressed suits. For once, he didn't want to look like the powerful CEO. He grabbed a simple black sweater and dark jeans, clothes he rarely wore. The man in the mirror looked less intimidating, more human somehow. His hands weren't quite steady as he pulled on his coat. The elevator doors opened with their usual soft ping, but tonight the sound seemed louder, more final. James stepped inside, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it hadn't since his first major real estate deal. This was different, though. Business deals he could handle. They were clean, logical, predictable. But walking into Elena's home, facing his daughters on their turf, there was nothing predictable about that. The elevator began its descent and James closed his eyes. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this nervous. Actually, he could. It was the day he'd first met Elena, back when he was just a hungry young businessman and she was the brilliant law student who saw right through his facade. Now he was walking back into her world, but this time he wasn't the confident young man with everything to prove. He was a father trying to make up for 8 years of absence, even if it wasn't his fault. His heart pounded harder with each floor the elevator passed. This wasn't just another meeting. This wasn't just another deal. This was his chance, maybe his only chance, to prove to Mia and Grace that he meant what he said, that he would do anything to be part of their lives. The elevator reached the lobby and James stepped out, nodding briefly to the doorman. The familiar motion felt strange tonight, mechanical. Everything felt different now that his carefully constructed world had been turned upside down by 2 little girls with his eyes and Elena's determination. James grabbed his keys from the valet, his hands uncharacteristically damp. He was never nervous. James Calloway didn't do nervous. But tonight, heading to Elena's apartment, he felt like his entire future hung by a thread. He slid into the driver's seat of his Mercedes, gripping the steering wheel tightly. This was it. No turning back now. James stood before the weathered brownstone, its brick facade a stark contrast to the gleaming glass towers he called home. The street was quiet, lined with trees whose leaves rustled in the evening breeze. Through the windows, warm light spilled onto the sidewalk, making the place feel alive in a way his sterile penthouse never did. His knuckles had barely grazed the door when it swung open. Mia stood there, her small frame blocking the entrance. Her eyes met his, calculating, measuring, judging. No words passed between them, but her slight step backward was invitation enough. The apartment's warmth enveloped him immediately. A gentle scent of vanilla and well-worn books filled the air, so different from the artificial freshness of his own home. His designer shoes sank into a plush, if slightly worn, carpet runner. His gaze caught on the photos lining the hallway walls. They told a story. His chest tightened as he took in each moment he'd missed. Elena cradling 2 tiny bundles in a hospital bed, her tired smile radiating joy. The twins in matching butterfly costumes, their faces painted in vibrant colors. Elena kneeling between them at what looked like a school science fair, all 3 beaming with pride. More snapshots of their life together lined the walls. Birthdays, holidays, ordinary moments made extraordinary through a mother's love. Elena in an apron, flour dusting her cheek as she helped tiny hands roll cookie dough. The twins asleep on either side of her, a storybook open across her lap. James's throat constricted. Each photo was a moment he should have been there for. Each smile, each milestone, each ordinary day, all of it had happened without him. The weight of 8 years of absence pressed down on his shoulders. Mia and Grace stood silently in the hallway, watching his every reaction. Their eyes tracked his movements as he absorbed their world, their history, the life that had gone on without him. Grace stepped forward, holding something in her hands. A leather-bound journal, its edges soft and worn from frequent handling. The cover was cracked in places, speaking of years of use. "Mom's journal," Grace said softly, her voice carrying in the quiet space. "She wrote about you." James looked down at the journal Grace held out to him. His hands weren't quite steady as he reached for it. The leather was warm from Grace's grip, smooth in places where Elena's hands had held it countless times before. He ran his thumb along the spine, feeling the deep creases there. Inside these pages lay Elena's thoughts, her pain, her truth. Their truth. Everything he'd missed, everything he'd lost. It was all there, waiting to be read. His fingers rested on the cover, but he couldn't quite bring himself to open it yet. The weight of it in his hands felt heavier than any contract he'd ever signed, any deal he'd ever made. This wasn't business. This was raw, unfiltered reality. Elena's reality. His daughter's reality. The reality he should have been part of. James's fingers traced the worn leather cover of Elena's journal, its pages soft and dog-eared from years of use. The kitchen around him felt lived in, dishes drying by the sink, a child's drawing magnetized to the fridge, the lingering scent of tonight's dinner still in the air. Everything about this place spoke of a life he'd missed. He opened to the first page, Elena's familiar handwriting flowing across the lines. Her words transported him back, to college, to stolen moments between classes, to promises he thought he'd kept but hadn't. "Dear Diary," the first entry began, dated just after he'd last seen her. "I don't know how to tell him. I'm pregnant and I'm terrified, but I know James will be there for us. He has to be." His throat tightened. Page after page revealed Elena's journey. Her growing belly, her determination to reach him, her confusion when his number stopped working. The letters she wrote but never sent filled entire sections, each one more desperate than the last. "The twins kicked today," one entry read. "I wonder if they know their father's out there somewhere. I wonder if he'd love them as much as I already do." James's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. He found detailed accounts of sleepless nights with colicky babies, first steps, first words. Every milestone he should have witnessed, preserved in Elena's careful script. "Mia said mama today," Elena had written. Grace followed an hour later. "They do everything together, these beautiful girls. Sometimes I see James in their expressions, in the way they furrow their brows when they're thinking hard about something. It breaks my heart a little every time." The entries continued, chronicling years of birthday parties, school plays, and quiet moments. Elena's love for their daughters radiated from every word, but beneath it all ran an undercurrent of sadness, of questions unanswered. 8 years, one of the final entries read. Sometimes I look at old photos and try to imagine what he's doing now. Does he ever think of us? Does he ever wonder? The girls are getting older. They're starting to ask questions I don't know how to answer. How do you tell your children their father chose not to know them? Or did he? Some days I'm not sure anymore. James closed the journal slowly, the weight of Elena's words settling heavy in his chest. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence. He could feel Mia and Grace's eyes on him, waiting, measuring his reaction to their mother's pain. For the first time in his life, James Calloway, master of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, had absolutely nothing to say. No clever response, no business strategy could fix this. The truth of what he'd lost sat before him in Elena's written words and in the watchful eyes of his daughters. James woke before his alarm, his mind already racing. The leather journal sat on his nightstand, a reminder of everything he'd missed. For the first time in years, his thoughts weren't consumed by stock prices or property values. Instead, he saw 2 pairs of identical eyes watching, waiting to see if he'd prove himself worthy. He reached for his phone, thumbing through his calendar. Important meetings filled his morning, deals worth millions. Without hesitation, he started canceling them all. His assistant's voice crackled through the speaker. "Sir, the Thompson deal?" "Reschedule everything," James said firmly. Something more important came up. The drive to the girls' school felt surreal. His Mercedes looked out of place among the minivans and family sedans in the drop-off line. He parked and waited, his heart beating faster when he spotted Elena's silver sedan pulling up. Mia and Grace stepped out, matching backpacks slung over their shoulders. They froze when they saw him walking toward them. "What are you doing here?" Mia asked, her voice careful, measured. James knelt down, bringing himself to their eye level. His expensive suit touched the concrete, but he didn't care. "Because I should have been here a long time ago, walking you to class, carrying your books, being..." He swallowed hard. "Being your father." Parents and children streamed past them, some stopping to stare. Everyone knew who James Calloway was. His face had been in business magazines, his name on buildings. But here he was, kneeling before 2 little girls. His usual commanding presence softened. "You canceled your meetings?" Grace asked quietly, her eyes searching his face. "All of them," James confirmed. "This matters more." Mia crossed her arms, but her expression wasn't as hard as usual. "You can't just show up and expect everything to be okay." "I know," James said. "I'm not expecting that. I just want to be here. Today. If you'll let me." A moment passed. Other parents whispered, pointing discreetly. The great James Calloway, brought to his knees by 2 8-year-olds. Grace shifted her backpack, then did something unexpected. She smiled. It was small, hesitant, but real. The first genuine smile she'd ever given him. Mia watched him carefully, then gave a single nod. It wasn't forgiveness or trust, but it was permission. Permission to walk them to class, to be present for one small moment in their lives. James stood, brushing off his knees. "May I carry your bags?" The girls exchanged looks, having one of those silent conversations that only twins can have. Finally, they handed over their backpacks. James felt the weight of them in his hands, filled with books, pencils, the everyday items of childhood he'd never known about. Each step toward the school entrance felt significant, like he was walking into a world he should have been part of all along. The evening light painted Manhattan's skyline in shades of amber and gold as James sat in his penthouse, his mind churning. The leather journal's words haunted him. Elena's struggles, the tiny apartment, working multiple jobs to make ends meet. His fingers tightened around his phone. He could fix this. He knew how to fix things. 3 calls later, it was done. The prestigious private school would never see another tuition payment from Elena. The cramped apartment building, now under his ownership, with their unit fully paid off. 2 trust funds set up and filled with more money than most people see in a lifetime. James felt lighter, better. This was what he was good at, solving problems with resources, making life easier. The next afternoon, when Mia and Grace arrived at his penthouse, he couldn't wait to tell them. "I've taken care of everything," he said, pulling out the documents. "School is covered through college. The apartment is yours, and there's money set aside." Mia's face changed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You think money fixes everything?" Her voice was quiet, dangerous. James blinked. I'm trying to help." "Help?" Mia's hands balled into fists. "Mom worked 3 jobs to put us through school. She never wanted your money. She wanted you to care." Grace shifted uncomfortably beside her sister, looking at the floor. "But I do care," James protested. "That's why I'm throwing money at us?" Mia's voice cracked. "Like we're just another problem you can solve with your checkbook." "Mia, please, you don't get it." She was shouting now, tears in her eyes. "We didn't want your money 8 years ago, and we don't want it now. We wanted a father." The words hit James like a physical blow. He watched, helpless, as Mia turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Grace hesitated for a moment, then followed her sister quietly. James sank into his leather chair, surrounded by the trappings of his wealth. The expensive art, the designer furniture, the view worth millions. For the first time, it all felt hollow. Empty. Meaningless. He'd thought he was helping. He'd thought money would make their lives better, easier. But Mia's words echoed in his head. "We wanted a father." In his silent penthouse, James finally understood. All these years of building his empire, of measuring success in dollars and cents, none of it mattered. He couldn't buy his way out of this one. He couldn't write a check big enough to heal the wounds he'd left. Money wasn't the answer. It never had been. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Elena's apartment as Mia helped pack their school lunches. She was still angry at James, throwing money around like it could fix 8 years of absence. Grace watched her sister's tense movements from the kitchen table. "Maybe he was trying to help," Grace said softly. Mia shook her head. "Money isn't what we needed." A thud from the living room made them both freeze. Then came the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. "Mom!" Grace called out. No answer. The twins rushed to the living room. Elena lay crumpled on the floor, her face pale and sweaty. Mia dropped to her knees beside their mother. "Mom, wake up!" Her voice cracked with panic. Grace's hands shook as she grabbed the house phone, dialing 911. "My mom collapsed," she told the operator, her voice trembling. "She's not waking up." While they waited for the ambulance, Grace made another call. Her fingers hesitated over James's number, but she pressed dial. "Grace?" His voice was surprised. They hadn't spoken since yesterday. "Mom's sick," Grace choked out. "We're going to the hospital. I don't know what to do." James's response was immediate. "Which hospital?" "I'm on my way." The ambulance arrived within minutes. Mia held Elena's hand while the paramedics worked, her anger at James forgotten in the face of real fear. Grace clutched her sister's other hand as they rode to the hospital. James was already there when they arrived, pacing the emergency room entrance. When he saw them, something in his face changed. The usual controlled mask slipped, revealing genuine concern. The nurses whisked Elena away for tests, leaving the twins and James in the sterile waiting room. Mia sat rigid in her chair, while Grace curled up against her sister. James stood nearby, unsure of his place but unwilling to leave. Hours passed. Doctors came and went. James handled the paperwork, insurance forms, making sure Elena got the best care possible. But money couldn't speed up test results or ease the worry etched on his daughters' faces. Finally, Elena's doctor emerged. Her expression made James's stomach drop. "Mr. Calloway," she said quietly, "could you step outside for a moment?" James glanced at the twins, who were now both asleep in their chairs, exhausted from worry. He followed the doctor into the hallway, where fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows. The doctor's face was grim as she held up Elena's test results. James felt his chest tighten. For all his wealth and power, he suddenly felt completely helpless. This isn't just exhaustion or stress, the doctor said softly, and James knew their lives were about to change again. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as James stepped into Elena's hospital room. The sterile smell of disinfectant hung in the air, mixed with the faint beeping of monitors. Elena lay propped up against white pillows, her dark hair a stark contrast against the pallid sheets. Despite her weakness, her blue eyes remained as piercing as ever. Mia and Grace sat on either side of her bed, their small hands clutching hers. They looked up as James entered, their faces drawn with worry. Elena's gaze shifted between them, then settled on James. "Leave us," she said softly, giving the girl's hands a gentle squeeze. "I need to speak with James alone." Mia's jaw tightened. "Mom, we don't want to—" "Just for a few minutes, sweetheart," Elena assured her, managing a small smile. "I promise." Grace stood first, tugging gently at her sister's sleeve. Mia hesitated, then slowly released her mother's hand. They walked to the door, both turning back for one last look before stepping out. James moved to the chair beside Elena's bed, the plastic creaking under his weight. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. He couldn't remember the last time they'd been alone together. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, marking each passing second. "They don't trust easily, James," Elena finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After everything, they can't afford to." James leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "I know. I'm trying to—" "No," Elena cut him off, shaking her head slightly. "You're trying to buy their trust. That's not how it works." She paused, taking a labored breath. "If you screw this up, they'll never forgive you. And I won't be here to fix it." The words hit James like a physical blow. He'd been avoiding this reality since the doctor pulled him aside earlier. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, advanced, aggressive. The prognosis was measured in months, not years. Elena reached out, her thin fingers finding his hand. Her touch was cool, but her grip was surprisingly firm. "Don't let them hate you, James. They're going to need you more than ever." James felt his throat tighten. After years of maintaining perfect control in every situation, he found himself completely helpless. He couldn't negotiate with this, couldn't throw money at it, couldn't make it disappear with a phone call. "I don't know how to be what they need," he admitted, the words rough in his throat. "Then learn," Elena replied simply. Her eyes began to flutter, exhaustion clearly taking hold. "Just don't give up on them, no matter how hard they push you away." Her grip on his hand loosened as her eyes closed fully. James sat there, watching her chest rise and fall with each shallow breath, realizing with crushing clarity that this was goodbye. Not just to him, but to everything they could have been, everything they should have been. This was Elena trusting him one last time, entrusting him with the most precious things in her world. And this time, he couldn't afford to fail. The morning sun cast long shadows through the hospital parking lot as James led Mia and Grace to his car. The girls moved like sleepwalkers, their faces blank, their matching navy coats wrinkled from a night spent in hospital chairs. The click of their shoes against the pavement echoed in the heavy silence. James opened the car door, but neither girl acknowledged him. They slipped into the back seat without a word, leaving in careful space between them. In the rearview mirror, he could see Grace staring out the window, her breath fogging the glass. Mia sat rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The drive felt endless. James gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, searching for the right words. Everything he thought to say felt hollow, inadequate. The city streets blurred past, but the silence in the car grew thicker with each passing minute. "Are you—" He started, then stopped. "Are you okay?" Of course they weren't okay. Nothing about this was okay. Grace sniffled quietly, quickly wiping her eyes with her sleeve. The sound made James's chest ache. He wanted to reach out, to comfort them somehow, but he didn't know how. He'd never learned. "We could stop somewhere," he offered weakly. "Get something to eat, maybe?" No response. Or we could. Just take us home, Mia cut in, her voice sharp and cold. James nodded, swallowing hard. They drove the rest of the way in silence, the weight of loss pressing down on all of them. When they reached Elena's apartment building, James helped them with their bags. His movements felt clumsy, uncertain. Grace accepted her backpack without meeting his eyes. Mia snatched hers away before he could even fully extend his hand. In the apartment, everything looked exactly as they'd left it yesterday morning. Elena's coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter. Her reading glasses lay folded on the coffee table. The sight made James's stomach twist. "Girls," he tried again, "I know this is—" "She trusted you?" Mia suddenly burst out, whirling to face him. Her eyes blazed with anger and hurt. "She trusted you, and now she's gone." The words hit James like a physical blow. He stood there, stunned, as Mia grabbed Grace's hand and pulled her down the hallway. 2 doors slammed in quick succession, the sound echoing through the apartment like gunshots. James sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. The silence that followed was deafening. He could hear muffled crying from behind one of the closed doors, but he knew he wasn't welcome there. Not anymore. Maybe not ever again. Elena's last words echoed in his mind. "Don't let them hate you." But sitting there, surrounded by the remnants of the life she'd built without him, James realized it might already be too late. James stood in Elena's bedroom, the afternoon light filtering through dusty curtains. The space felt hollow now, yet somehow still held echoes of her presence. The vanilla-scented candle on her dresser, the dog-eared book on her nightstand, the small silver frame holding a photo of Mia and Grace's first day of school. His fingers trembled as he opened the drawer, bills, receipts, a half-empty bottle of aspirin. Then, tucked in the back corner, a plain white envelope. His name written in her careful script. James sank onto the edge of her bed, the mattress creaking softly. The envelope felt heavy in his hands, though it held only a single sheet of paper. He broke the seal carefully, unfolding the letter with unsteady fingers. "Dear James, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. There's so much I never told you, so much I kept from Mia and Grace. Not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because some truths need to be discovered, not told. I never hated you, James. Even when I thought you'd abandoned us, I couldn't bring myself to hate you. Maybe that makes me weak. Or maybe I just knew, somewhere deep down, that there was more to the story. The girls are so much like you. Mia has your determination, your fire. Grace has your quiet strength, your ability to see beneath the surface. They're the best parts of both of us. I never told them about your parents' interference. I never showed them the returned letters or the blocked calls, because I wanted them to choose you for themselves without guilt or obligation. They needed to see the man you are, not the victim of circumstance. If you're reading this, I need you to do something for me. Don't give up on them, even if they push you away, even if they say they hate you, even if it feels impossible, because they're your daughters, James, and they need you more than they'll ever admit. They're scared right now, scared of losing another parent, scared of trusting and being hurt again, but they're worth fighting for. They're worth everything. Be patient with them. Be present. Show them that love isn't about grand gestures or money or making up for lost time. It's about being there, day after day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. With hope, Elena. James clutched the letter, his vision blurring. A drop of moisture fell onto the paper, smudging Elena's signature. He quickly wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, careful not to damage her final words. The truth of her letter hit him like a physical blow. All this time, Elena had protected him, protected their daughters, given them the chance to find their way to each other without the weight of the past. He folded the letter carefully, sliding it back into its envelope. His chest felt tight, his throat raw. But beneath the grief, something else stirred. Determination. Purpose. Elena was right. He wouldn't give up on Mia and Grace. Not now. Not ever. James stared at Elena's letter, his fingers tracing the edges worn smooth from countless readings. The city lights twinkled beyond his penthouse windows, but he barely noticed them. His world had shrunk to this piece of paper and the weight of the promise he'd made to Elena. A knock echoed through the quiet space, 3 soft taps that made his heart skip. When he opened the door, Mia and Grace stood there in matching black dresses, their funeral clothes. Their faces were pale, eyes rimmed red. They looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than he'd ever seen them. "Can we?" Grace's voice trailed off, uncertain. James stepped back, holding the door wide. "Come in." They moved past him like little ghosts, their shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. Neither sat down. They just stood there, looking lost in the vast space of his living room. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. James waited, knowing this moment was too fragile to rush. Finally, Mia spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't know what we're doing here." James's chest tightened. He moved closer, careful to give them space. "Then let's figure it out together." Grace hugged herself, looking around the room. "Mom used to say you lived in the clouds." She wasn't wrong, James admitted, gesturing to the view. "But it gets lonely up here." Mia's eyes found Elena's letter on his desk. "Is that from her?" James nodded. "She wrote it before." He couldn't finish the sentence. "Can we read it?" Grace asked, and "Of course." They moved to the desk together. James watched as they read their mother's words, their shoulders touching, supporting each other like they always did. Tears slipped down Grace's cheeks. Mia's hands trembled. When they finished, neither moved. The letter lay between them like a bridge, connecting their world to his. "She wanted us to give you a chance," Mia said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve one," James admitted, "but I'm asking for it anyway." Grace looked up at him, her eyes so much like Elena's it hurt. "We're not ready to trust you yet." "I know, but—" Mia hesitated, glancing at her sister. "We're not walking away either." For the first time since Elena died, James felt something like hope flutter in his chest. He didn't reach for them, didn't try to hug them or make promises he might not be able to keep. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you." The twins exchanged a look, one of those silent conversations he was starting to recognize. Then Grace spoke softly. "Can we stay? Just for a little while?" "As long as you want," James answered. They settled on his leather couch, still maintaining their distance but not running away. It wasn't forgiveness or trust or even acceptance, but it was something. A beginning, perhaps. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of James's penthouse, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. He blinked awake, his mind immediately racing to the events of last night. The girls had fallen asleep on his leather couch, exhausted from grief and uncertainty. He'd covered them with blankets, not daring to wake them. Now the sound of spoons clinking against bowls drifted from his rarely used kitchen. His heart thumped as he pulled on his robe and stepped into the hallway. There they were, Mia and Grace perched on his chrome bar stools, eating Cheerios from matching white bowls. They'd found them in his cupboard somehow, along with the milk he couldn't remember buying. Their matching pajamas were wrinkled from sleeping on the couch, their dark hair tousled. James stood in the doorway, suddenly aware of how sterile his kitchen looked. No drawings on the fridge, no sticky fingerprints on the counters, no evidence that children had ever existed here before this moment. "Morning," he said softly, not wanting to break whatever spell had made them stay. Grace looked up, giving him a small nod. Mia kept her eyes on her cereal, but her shoulders tensed slightly at his voice. James moved carefully to the coffee maker, his usual morning routine feeling strange with an audience. The machine hummed to life, filling the silence. "You can stay here," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat. "As long as you want. There's plenty of room." Mia's spoon clinked against her bowl. "We haven't decided yet." Her voice was quiet but firm. Grace glanced at her sister, then nudged her gently with an elbow. "But we're still here," she added, her voice softer than Mia's. James nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He watched them eat, these two little girls who had turned his perfectly ordered world upside down. The morning sun caught their dark hair, highlighting the same stubborn chin he saw in the mirror every day. His gaze drifted around his pristine kitchen, all stainless steel and marble, designed for show rather than comfort. It had always felt exactly right for his lifestyle. But now, watching Mia and Grace eating their simple breakfast, he realized how empty it had been. How empty he had been. For the first time since buying this place, the penthouse felt like more than just expensive square footage. It felt like something else. Something he'd never had before. It felt like home. The kitchen filled with smoke as James frantically waved a dish towel at the burning pan. What was supposed to be a simple pasta dinner had turned into chaos. The garlic, which he'd forgotten about while checking the recipe on his phone, had transformed from golden brown to charred black in seconds. "Dad, the smoke alarm!" Grace called out, covering her ears as the piercing beep filled the penthouse. James's heart skipped a beat at hearing her call him Dad for the first time, but he had more pressing matters, namely, the disaster unfolding in his kitchen. Mia rolled her eyes from her spot at the counter. "We could have just ordered food," she said, but there was a hint of amusement in her voice. "You know, like normal people?" "This is kind of hilarious," Grace giggled, watching James climb onto a chair to reach the smoke alarm. His usually perfect hair was messed up, and his expensive dress shirt was splattered with tomato sauce. To everyone's surprise, James started laughing too. Not his usual controlled chuckle, but a genuine, full-bodied laugh that made his shoulders shake. "I thought I could handle this," he admitted, stepping down from the chair. "I really did." "Maybe stick to real estate," Mia suggested, but she was fighting back a smile. James looked at the ruined pan and the ingredients scattered across the counter. "How about grilled cheese instead?" "You know how to make grilled cheese?" Grace asked skeptically. "I can figure it out," James said, already reaching for his phone. 20 minutes later, they sat around the kitchen island eating slightly burnt but edible grilled cheese sandwiches. The formal dining room, with its long mahogany table and crystal chandelier, sat empty and forgotten. "This isn't actually terrible," Mia admitted, taking another bite. "High praise," James smiled, watching as Grace cut her sandwich into tiny triangles before eating them one by one. The conversation flowed easier than it ever had before. They talked about school, about Grace's art class, about Mia's upcoming science project. No heavy topics, no painful memories, just simple everyday things. James watched them joke and tease each other, saw how Grace's eyes crinkled when she laughed, how Mia's serious expression softened when she smiled. For the first time since they'd walked into his life, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He felt like their father. "Next time," Grace said, licking melted cheese off her fingers, "maybe we should all cook together." "Yeah," Mia agreed, surprising everyone. "But we're teaching you the basics first. No more burning garlic." James felt warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the grilled cheese. "Deal," he said softly, memorizing every detail of this moment. The hallway was quiet except for the soft padding of James's feet on the plush carpet. His hand brushed against the wall as he walked past the girls' rooms, their doors slightly ajar. The warm glow of bedside lamps spilled into the hallway. He paused, taking a deep breath. These nighttime check-ins still felt new, uncertain. "Good night, girls," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough to reach them. Grace's head popped up from her book. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, something shifted in her eyes. She set her book down and slid off her bed. James's breath caught as Grace walked toward him. Before he could process what was happening, her small arms wrapped around his waist. The gesture was so unexpected, so genuine, that James felt his throat tighten. His hands hovered awkwardly for a moment before settling gently on her back. The simple contact made his heart ache with a mixture of joy and regret for all the hugs he'd missed. Movement from Mia's room caught his attention. She stood in her doorway watching them. Her face showed a battle between wanting to maintain her walls and yearning to join in. James held his breath, not daring to pressure her. Then, with determined steps, Mia crossed the hallway. She hesitated for just a second before pressing herself against his other side. James felt tears prick at his eyes as he wrapped his arm around her too. The three of them stood there, wrapped in an embrace that felt both foreign and perfectly right. James closed his eyes, memorizing every detail. The soft cotton of their pajamas, the slight tremor in Mia's shoulders, the way Grace's fingers clutched at his shirt. "Good night," Grace mumbled into his shirt. James swallowed hard, his voice rough with emotion. "Good night, sweetheart." Then, so quietly he almost missed it, Mia whispered, "Good night, Dad." James's heart stuttered in his chest. That single word, Dad, hit him with the force of a tidal wave. His arms tightened slightly around them, afraid they might disappear if he let go. For the first time since learning about their existence, James felt the full weight and joy of fatherhood settle into his bones. He wasn't just their biological father anymore. He was their dad, and nothing in his life had ever meant more. James bolted upright in bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. The nightmare clung to him like a cold sweat. He'd walked through the penthouse calling for Mia and Grace, but they were gone. Their rooms empty, closets bare, no trace they'd ever been there. He rubbed his face with trembling hands. The digital clock read 6:15 a.m. Sunlight was just beginning to peek through the floor-to-ceiling windows. James swung his legs over the side of the bed, trying to shake off the lingering unease. Without thinking, he padded to the girls' rooms. Their doors were open, just as they'd left them last night. Mia was curled up like a cat, her dark hair spilling across her pillow. Grace lay sprawled out, one arm dangling off the bed. Both peaceful. Both here. James let out a shaky breath. Then, driven by an impulse he didn't quite understand, he headed to the kitchen. He pulled out flour, eggs, milk. Everything needed for pancakes. Not just any pancakes. Chocolate chip pancakes, the ones they'd mentioned loving during one of their quiet dinner conversations. The first batch came out looking more like abstract art than actual pancakes. The second wasn't much better. By the third try, they were at least somewhat round, even if the chocolate chips had melted into strange patterns. The smell of butter and chocolate drifted through the penthouse. He heard movement upstairs, then footsteps on the stairs. Grace appeared first, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She stopped short at the sight of James standing over a griddle, spatula in hand. Her lips twitched. "Are those supposed to be pancakes?" she asked, trying not to laugh. Mia came up behind her sister, eyebrows raised at the scene before her. "They look like they got run over," she said, but there was a hint of amusement in her voice. James looked down at his creation and had to admit they were right. "They taste better than they look," he defended weakly. Grace pulled out a chair at the counter, reaching for a plate. "We'll be the judges of that." To his surprise, Mia joined her sister, grabbing her own plate. She cut into a pancake, examining it with mock seriousness before taking a bite. Her expression softened just slightly. "Not terrible," she admitted, taking another bite. Grace was less reserved in her approval, already halfway through her stack. "The ugly ones taste better anyway," she declared with chocolate-smeared conviction. James watched them eat, something warm and steady settling in his chest. The panic from his nightmare felt distant now, replaced by the simple reality of this moment. His daughters, in their pajamas, eating his misshapen pancakes on a regular Wednesday morning. This wasn't a special occasion or a calculated attempt to win them over. It was just breakfast, normal, ordinary, real. Mia caught him staring and rolled her eyes, but there was no edge to it anymore. "You should probably flip those before they burn," she pointed out. James turned back to the griddle with a start, managing to save the current batch just in time. As he slid them onto a fresh plate, he realized something. He wasn't worried anymore about them disappearing. They were here critiquing his cooking, making themselves at home. This wasn't temporary. This was their life now. The afternoon sun filtered through the penthouse windows, casting long shadows across the living room floor. James sat at his desk, reviewing contracts when his phone buzzed. The name on the screen made his chest tighten. Margaret Calloway. He stared at it, his finger hovering over the screen. For a moment, he considered letting it go to voicemail. But he knew his mother. She wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. With a deep breath, he answered, "Mother." "James." Her voice was crisp, cold as winter frost. "We need to talk about those children." His jaw clenched. Even through the phone, he could feel her disapproval, thick as poison. "They're my daughters." "Your daughters?" Margaret's laugh was sharp, cutting. "Or a mistake you refuse to fix?" James's knuckles went white around the phone. The same hands that had hidden letters, erased phone calls, buried the truth for 8 years, now trying to erase Mia and Grace again. "They're staying with me," he said, his voice firm. "Don't be ridiculous, James. You have a legacy to protect. The Calloway name means something." He didn't hear the soft footsteps behind him, didn't notice Mia and Grace entering the room, their eyes wide as they listened. "Your father and I worked too hard to build this family's reputation," Margaret continued. "We can't have it tarnished by some unfortunate situation." Something snapped inside James. All the years of control, of following their rules, of letting them shape his life. It ended now. An unfortunate situation? His voice dropped dangerously low. "You hid my children from me. You intercepted letters, deleted calls, erased every trace of them. We did what was necessary." "No," James cut her off. "You did what was cruel and controlling and unforgivable." He turned in his chair and froze. Mia and Grace stood there watching him with identical expressions, a mixture of surprise and something else. Hope, maybe. Margaret's voice turned sharp as glass. "Send them away, James. You have a legacy to protect." James looked at his daughters, really looked at them. He saw Grace's quiet strength, Mia's fierce determination. He saw Elena in their eyes, in the way they held themselves. And he saw himself, not the cold businessman his parents had shaped, but the father he was becoming. "I don't need your money," he said quietly. "I don't need your name, and I sure as hell don't need your approval." "James, goodbye, Mother." He ended the call, the silence afterward ringing in his ears. Then he turned to Mia and Grace, who hadn't moved. "She will never take you away from me again," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Never. For the first time since they'd walked into his life, both girls looked at him with complete trust. They believed him. Finally, truly believed him. Thunder rumbled outside as rain pelted against the penthouse windows. In James's office, Mia and Grace knelt on the carpet, a dusty, leather-bound album spread between them. Their fingers traced over faded photographs, a young boy in pressed suits standing stiffly beside stern-faced adults. "Is this you?" Grace asked, pointing to a particular photo. A teenage James stood alone at what appeared to be a graduation ceremony, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Before they could flip another page, James appeared in the doorway. He froze, seeing the album open before them. Something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe fear. Mia looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Did your father ever love you?" The question hung heavy in the air, punctuated by another roll of thunder. James's shoulders tensed, then sagged. He walked over and sat down beside them on the floor, his expensive suit wrinkling against the carpet. "No," he said finally, his voice rough. "He only loved his legacy." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating their faces for a brief moment. Grace's fingers traced the edge of a photo showing James's father, their grandfather, standing cold and distant beside his son. "Is that why you were going to do the same to us?" Grace's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through James like a knife. He felt the air leave his lungs. The truth of her words hit him hard. He had been following the same path, hadn't he? Building walls, focusing on legacy over love, just like his father had done. James moved to kneel in front of them both, his eyes burning with intensity. "I will never be like him. I refuse to be." The storm outside grew quieter, as if holding its breath. Grace nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. Then Mia, who had been silent, spoke so softly James almost missed it. "Then don't let us go." James pulled them both into his arms, holding them tight against his chest. In that embrace was every promise he needed to make. To be better, to be present, to be the father they deserved, to never become the man who had raised him. "Never," he whispered into their hair. "I promise." The soft glow of chandeliers cast warm light across the elegant interior of La Maison d'Or. James adjusted his tie as he held the heavy wooden door open for Mia and Grace. The familiar scent of fine cuisine filled the air, but something felt different tonight. The maitre d' recognized James immediately, his eyebrows rising slightly at the sight of the twins beside him. "Mr. Calloway, your usual table?" "Yes, please," James replied, his hand resting gently on Grace's shoulder. "But we'll need 3 seats tonight." They followed the maitre d' through the restaurant. Other diners glanced their way, some doing double takes. James Calloway was known here, but never with company, and certainly never with children. At their table, Mia and Grace settled into their chairs with practiced ease. Gone was the stiff formality from that first night. Now they lounged comfortably, giggling as they opened their menus. "I already know what you both want," James said with a small smile. When the waiter approached, James ordered without hesitation. The grilled chicken with extra roasted vegetables for Mia, she doesn't like mushrooms, and the petite filet well done with mashed potatoes for Grace. The waiter blinked in surprise, then turned to the girls. "Is that correct?" "Perfect," they answered in unison, sharing a grin. The restaurant's sophisticated atmosphere felt warmer somehow, filled with Mia's quiet laughter as Grace told a story about their day at school. James watched them, remembering how he used to value the solitude of dining alone. Now, the thought seemed absurd. Their food arrived, steaming and perfectly prepared. Grace cut into her steak with delight while Mia arranged her vegetables in neat sections on her plate, a habit James had quickly learned to recognize. "Remember when we first came here?" Mia asked, taking a sip of her sparkling apple juice. "You looked so shocked." James chuckled. "I was. Best shock of my life, though." Grace smiled, her eyes soft. "Mom would be happy, you know, seeing us here together." A comfortable silence fell over the table. Then Mia raised her glass, the crystal catching the light. "To Dad." James felt his throat tighten as he lifted his wine glass. The word Dad still hit him right in the chest every time they said it. He looked at his daughters, really looked at them, and knew with absolute certainty that all his millions meant nothing compared to this moment. "To family," he replied softly, as their glasses clinked together. If you enjoyed the story of James, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.